Ma'am, step away from the vehicle now. The police officer's voice echoed across the rainy street. Several pedestrians stopped walking. A woman carrying groceries froze halfway across the crosswalk. Two teenagers pulled out their phones. And standing beside a black luxury SUV worth more than most houses on the block, an elderly black woman slowly raised her hands. Not because she had done anything wrong, because she didn't know what else to do. Rain dripped from the sleeves of her worn brown coat. Her gray hair clung to her forehead. The grocery bag at her feet had split open. A loaf of bread rested in a puddle. One carton of eggs had already cracked. The woman looked exhausted. The kind of exhausted that doesn't come from a bad day. The kind that comes from a hard life. Interesting. Very interesting. Because from a distance, she looked exactly like what many people assumed she was. Poor. Alone. Forgotten. The police officer stepped closer. Ma'am, I'm asking you one last time. The woman blinked. Confused. I live here. Her voice trembled slightly. The officer glanced toward the property manager, standing beneath an umbrella. The man immediately shook his head. No, she doesn't. The old woman looked at him, then at the house, then back at him again. The small brick home behind them had been hers for 25 years. 25 years. Longer than some people in the crowd had been alive. Yet now strangers were telling her she didn't belong there. Interesting. Very interesting. Because sometimes losing a home begins long before someone takes the keys. The property manager folded his arms. She's been told repeatedly. The officer nodded. Sir, is this the individual you reported? Yes. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. As though he'd rehearsed it. The old woman lowered her eyes. Rainwater rolled down her cheeks. For a moment it looked like tears. Maybe it was. Maybe nobody could tell the difference anymore. Across the street, neighbors watched from porches. Some whispered. Some stared. Nobody intervened. Nobody knew the whole story. And nobody knew that within minutes, two men were about to arrive and change everything. But that's not where this story begins. Not really. To understand why an elderly woman stood in the rain facing police officers outside her own home, you have to go back 25 years. Back to a winter night. Back to a shelter. Back to two little boys who had absolutely nothing. And one woman who had almost nothing herself. Her name was Sarah Johnson. At the time, Sarah was 38 years old. She worked mornings cleaning office buildings, afternoons at a laundromat, weekends wherever she could find extra hours. Life wasn't easy. Some months she paid rent first and worried about food later. Other months she paid for food and prayed rent could wait. Either way, there was never much left. Her apartment sat above an old grocery store on the south side of Chicago. 2 small bedrooms, a leaking kitchen faucet, a heater that worked when it felt like working. Nothing fancy, nothing special, yet somehow it always felt warm, because Sarah had spent years turning survival into kindness. One December evening, after finishing a double shift, she stopped by a local church shelter. Not because she needed help, because she volunteered there whenever she could. Interesting. Very interesting. Because people who struggle the most often understand struggle best. The shelter smelled like coffee, wet coats, and old floor polish. Children sat coloring at folding tables. Volunteers handed out soup. Outside, snow covered the sidewalks. Inside, the heat fought to keep up. Sarah was stacking donated blankets when she noticed them. 2 boys. Identical. Maybe 6 years old. Maybe 7. Small for their age. Quiet. Too quiet. The boys sat together in a corner, holding the same worn backpack. One of them stared at the floor. The other watched the door, as though waiting for someone. Anyone. To come back. Sarah approached slowly. Hello. Neither boy answered. She smiled gently. I'm Sarah. A long pause followed. Finally, one of the twins spoke. Marcus. The other nodded. Michael. Sarah crouched beside them. Nice to meet you. The boys looked tired. Hungry. Scared. But what struck her most wasn't any of those things. It was the way they kept glancing toward the entrance. Still hoping. Still waiting. Children are stubborn like that. Especially when it comes to hope. Sarah eventually learned the truth. Their mother had died months earlier. No father had been located. Several temporary placements had failed. Relatives couldn't take them. The system was trying. But the system was crowded. And crowded systems sometimes miss broken hearts. That night, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about them. Not while riding the bus home. Not while making dinner. Not while lying awake listening to the old radiator rattle beside her bed. Marcus. Michael. Two little boys waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. Interesting. Very interesting. Because sometimes life changes long before we realize a decision has been made. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Sarah sat up in bed. The apartment was dark, silent, cold. She stared toward the empty second bedroom, the room she mostly used for storage. Then she whispered something to herself, something that would change 3 lives forever. If nobody takes them. She swallowed, then looked toward the doorway again. I will. Outside, snow continued falling over Chicago. Inside, Sarah Johnson had no idea what she was about to sacrifice. And she certainly had no idea that 25 years later, those same 2 little boys would become the only people standing between her and losing everything. The paperwork took almost 4 months. For long months. For months of interviews, background checks, home inspections, forms Sarah didn't fully understand, and questions that seemed impossible to answer. Can you financially support 2 children? The social worker asked. Sarah looked down at her hands. Hands rough from years of cleaning chemicals and laundromat machines. Then she answered honestly. No. The social worker blinked. Sarah smiled weakly. Not comfortably. A brief pause. But I'll find a way. Interesting. Very interesting. Because sometimes the most trustworthy answers aren't the confident ones. They're the honest ones. The system had concerns. Reasonable concerns. Sarah wasn't wealthy. She didn't own a house. Her savings account barely existed. Her car was older than some of the caseworkers reviewing her file. Yet every person involved noticed something. Whenever Marcus and Michael were mentioned, Sarah's face changed. And whenever Sarah entered the room, the twins stopped looking scared. That mattered. More than numbers. More than paperwork. More than anyone expected. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, the approval finally arrived. Sarah sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at the letter, reading the same sentence over and over again, then crying. Not because she was happy. Not exactly. Because she was terrified. Terrified of failing. Terrified of not being enough. Terrified of becoming responsible for 2 little lives. Interesting. Very interesting. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. That evening, Marcus and Michael arrived carrying everything they owned. 1 backpack, 2 small garbage bags, and a stuffed bear missing 1 eye. That was it. Everything else had been lost somewhere along the way. The apartment suddenly felt smaller. The second bedroom still contained old storage boxes, a broken lamp, winter coats, things Sarah never got around to organizing. Now it belonged to 2 boys. Marcus stood quietly near the doorway. Michael sat on the edge of the bed. Neither unpacked. Neither spoke. Sarah noticed immediately. Children who trust a place start exploring. Children who expect to leave stay ready. The boys were still ready. Still waiting for disappointment. Still preparing for goodbye. Sarah understood. More than they realized. That night she cooked spaghetti. The cheapest meal she knew how to make. The sauce came from a jar. The garlic bread was slightly burned. The plates didn't match. Nothing looked impressive. Yet halfway through dinner something happened. Marcus asked for seconds. Sarah smiled. Michael asked for thirds. Sarah laughed. And for the first time, the apartment sounded like a home. The years that followed weren't easy. Not even close. Some months the refrigerator looked almost empty. Other months the electricity bill arrived at exactly the wrong time. Sarah worked mornings cleaning office buildings. Afternoons at the laundromat. Evenings helping elderly neighbors with errands for extra money. She learned how to stretch. Every dollar. How to repair torn backpacks. How to make 1 chicken feed 3 people for several days. Interesting. Very interesting. Because children rarely remember luxury. They remember love. One winter, Marcus needed glasses. The prescription wasn't expensive, but expensive enough. Sarah stared at the bill for 2 days. Then quietly sold her television. The boys never found out. At least not then. Another year, Michael needed school supplies for a science competition. The registration fee wasn't much. Just enough to hurt. Sarah worked 3 extra weekend shifts. Standing 12 hours a day. Her feet aching. Her back burning. She never complained. Not once. Because every sacrifice felt smaller than the future she imagined for them. Every night before bed, Sarah followed the same routine. Homework first. Dinner second. Then reading. Marcus preferred adventure books. Michael loved biographies. The apartment would grow quiet. The city sounds drifting through old windows. Sirens. Traffic. Neighbors arguing somewhere down the block. Then Sarah would sit on the edge of the bed and tell them stories. Not fairy tales. Real stories. Stories about resilience. Stories about people who kept going when life got hard. Stories about dignity. One sentence appeared again and again, so often that both boys eventually memorized it. "The world may forget you," Sarah would say. The boys would smile. Then together they finished the sentence. "But don't ever forget who helped you become who you are." Interesting. Very interesting. Because neither Marcus nor Michael understood how important those words would become. Years passed. Slowly. Then suddenly. The way they always do. Marcus grew taller. Then Michael did. School pictures filled the apartment walls. Basketball trophies appeared on shelves. Report cards accumulated in kitchen drawers. Life wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were arguments. Teenage attitudes. Broken curfews. Bad decisions. The normal chaos of raising children. But through it all, one thing remained constant. Sarah showed up. Every game. Every school meeting. Every achievement. Every failure. When Marcus failed algebra, Sarah sat beside him for weeks. When Michael got suspended for fighting, Sarah marched into the principal's office. Not to excuse him, to hold him accountable, then help him do better. Because love isn't always soft. Sometimes love is showing up when nobody else does. One evening when the twins were 16, a guidance counselor called. Scholarship opportunities. College preparation. Advanced programs. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. But after hanging up, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, staring out the window. The boys were growing up. Really growing up. The future she'd spent years imagining was suddenly becoming real. Marcus walked into the room. Then Michael. They immediately noticed something. Sarah was crying. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind mothers hide when they think nobody is looking. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked. Sarah smiled. "Nothing. I'm just tired." The boys exchanged a glance. They knew better. Because after 10 years together, they knew her almost as well as she knew them. Michael sat beside her. Marcus on the other side. And for a few minutes nobody spoke. The kitchen clock ticked softly. Traffic moved outside. The apartment felt warm. Safe. Whole. Then Sarah looked at them. Really looked at them. Not the frightened boys from the shelter. Not anymore. Young men. Good men. Strong men. And for the first time, a thought crossed her mind. Maybe the hardest years were almost over. Maybe all those sacrifices had been worth it. What she didn't know was that life was about to test all three of them again. And the next chapter would pull them in different directions. Farther than any of them expected. The scholarships arrived 6 months later. 2 envelopes. 2 opportunities. 2 futures Sarah had spent more than a decade praying for. Marcus earned admission to a prestigious law program. Michael received a scholarship to a military academy. The news should have felt like victory. And it did. At first. The apartment filled with celebration. Neighbors stopped by. Teachers called. Friends congratulated them. For weeks, Sarah couldn't stop smiling. Interesting. Very interesting. Because sometimes the happiest moments carry the seeds of heartbreak. Not because anything is wrong. Because growth always requires letting go. The morning Marcus left for college, Sarah woke up before sunrise. She cooked breakfast even though nobody was hungry. Eggs. Toast. Coffee she barely touched. The apartment felt strangely quiet. Michael would leave 2 weeks later. For the first time in years, Sarah noticed how small the kitchen sounded when nobody was talking. Marcus loaded his bags into an old sedan. The scholarship covered tuition, not transportation. A church fundraiser helped with that. Neighbors contributed what they could. $20 here. $50 there. Enough. Just enough. Sarah stood beside the curb pretending she wasn't emotional. Pretending she wasn't watching her little boy drive away. Pretending she wasn't remembering the frightened child clutching a backpack in a shelter years ago. Then Marcus hugged her. Tightly. Longer than usual. Thank you. Sarah smiled. For what? Everything. The answer never came out completely. Neither of them trusted their voices enough. 2 weeks later, Michael left too. The apartment changed immediately. Not gradually. Immediately. Interesting. Very interesting. Because empty rooms make more noise than occupied ones. Sarah still cooked too much food. Still bought extra cereal. Still looked toward the hallway, expecting someone to appear. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Sometimes they never disappear at all. The first year went well. The boys called constantly. Almost every day. Sometimes twice. Marcus talked about professors. Michael talked about training. Sarah listened. Laughed. Offered advice. Reminded them to eat properly. Reminded them to sleep. reminded them that no matter how old they became, someone was still worrying about them. The second year felt different. Not worse, just different. Classes became harder. Responsibilities increased. Calls became weekly, then every other week, then whenever life allowed. Normal, completely normal. Yet every mother understands the feeling. The silence between calls always seems longer than it really is. Years passed. Marcus graduated near the top of his class. Michael earned honors in service. Both men built impressive careers. The kind of careers newspapers occasionally mention. The kind of careers that make parents proud. Sarah clipped every article she found. Every photograph. Every interview. She kept them in a cardboard box beneath her bed. Whenever loneliness arrived, she opened it. And remembered. Interesting. Very interesting. Because memory can feel like company when a house becomes too quiet. Meanwhile, life continued. The neighborhood slowly changed. New investors arrived. Old families moved away. Small businesses disappeared. Property values rose. Then rose again. Then rose some more. Sarah didn't pay much attention. She never cared about market trends, or development projects, or real estate forecasts. The house wasn't an investment. It was home. The place where Marcus learned to ride a bicycle. The place where Michael broke a window throwing a baseball indoors. The place where Christmas lights hung every December. The place where 3 people became a family. How do you put a price on that? You don't. At least Sarah didn't. Then came the first letter. The envelope looked official. Important. Complicated. The kind of document most people immediately dislike receiving. Sarah opened it at the kitchen table. The legal language made little sense. Property review. Ownership challenge. Development claim. Administrative dispute. The words blurred together. She read the letter 3 times. Still confused. Interesting. Very interesting. Because some problems become dangerous precisely because ordinary people don't understand them. Sarah called the phone number listed. The representative promised someone would contact her. Nobody did. Weeks passed. Then another letter arrived. This one sounded more serious. More urgent. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. The same knot she'd felt years earlier whenever money ran short. Except this wasn't money. This was home. Marcus was busy in court. Michael was overseas on assignment. Neither son knew how worried she had become. And Sarah wasn't about to tell them. Not yet. That was the problem. Sarah had spent 25 years protecting them. The habit had become automatic. Interesting. Very interesting. Because parents often keep carrying burdens. Long after their children become strong enough to help. The months that followed were exhausting. Meetings. Phone calls. Paperwork. Conflicting explanations. Nobody seemed willing to give a straight answer. One official said everything was fine. Another suggested hiring an attorney. A third claimed records were incomplete. The uncertainty became its own kind of punishment. Sarah slept less, ate less, worried more. Neighbors began noticing. You okay? They asked. Sarah always smiled. Always. I'm fine. The answer came easier each time, even when it wasn't true. One afternoon, she sat on the front porch holding an old photo album. Marcus at age 10. Michael at 12. Birthday cakes. School awards. Family cookouts. Tiny moments. Ordinary moments. The kind that become priceless years later. A tear slipped down her cheek. Not because she regretted anything. Never that. Because for the first time in decades, she felt alone. Really alone. The sun was setting when her phone rang. Marcus. His picture appeared on the screen. Sarah smiled immediately, then wiped her eyes before answering. Hello, sweetheart. Marcus heard it anyway. The sadness. The fatigue. The strain she thought she was hiding. Mama. A pause. What's wrong? Sarah looked toward the house. The house she feared losing. The house that contained her entire adult life. Then she lied. A small lie. A mother's lie. Nothing, baby. But hundreds of miles away. Marcus wasn't convinced. Not even a little. And for the first time in years, a feeling settled into his chest. A feeling he couldn't explain. Something was happening. Something important. And somehow, the woman who had saved his life was facing it alone. 3 weeks later, the rain arrived. Cold. Steady. Unforgiving. The kind of rain that makes an already difficult day feel impossible. Sarah Johnson stood at her kitchen window, watching water slide down the glass. A letter rested on the table behind her. The latest one. The worst one. Final notice. Those 2 words had stolen her sleep for nearly a week. Interesting. Very interesting. Because after surviving poverty, grief, and 25 years of sacrifice. The thing threatening to break her wasn't hardship. It was uncertainty. Nobody had clearly explained why her property ownership was suddenly being challenged. Nobody had provided answers that made sense. Only paperwork, deadlines, warnings, and promises that someone would eventually call her back. Nobody ever did. Sarah picked up the letter again. Her eyes moved across the same sentences she had read dozens of times. Legal review, property transfer dispute, development acquisition. The language felt deliberately confusing, like a conversation designed to exclude ordinary people. Outside, a black sedan slowly pulled up. Then another. Sarah frowned. She wasn't expecting visitors. A moment later, there was a knock at the door. Firm, professional, not friendly. The kind of knock that instantly makes people nervous. Sarah opened the door. Two men stood beneath umbrellas. One wore a tailored gray coat. The other carried a clipboard. Neither smiled. Mrs. Johnson? Sarah nodded. Yes. The man with the clipboard glanced down at his paperwork, then back at her. We're here regarding the property. The knot in Sarah's stomach tightened immediately. Interesting. Very interesting. Because some conversations become frightening before a single threat is spoken. The discussion lasted 20 minutes. Then 30, then longer, and somehow every answer created more questions. The representatives claimed the ownership records contained inconsistencies. Sarah showed them documents, receipts, tax records, years of payments, evidence she'd carefully saved for decades. The men barely looked at them. Instead, they repeated the same phrases. Our legal department will review. The matter remains unresolved. Further action may be necessary. Sarah listened, growing more frustrated, more confused, and more afraid. Not for herself, for the memories, for everything attached to this house. The kitchen where Marcus learned multiplication. The hallway where Michael crashed his first bicycle. The bedroom walls still carrying tiny repair marks from childhood accidents. How do you explain that to someone reading from a clipboard? You don't. Because they aren't discussing a home. They're discussing a file. Eventually the men left. The rain continued, and Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the silence. Interesting. Very interesting. Because loneliness feels heavier when important decisions are being made without you. That evening Marcus called again. This time Sarah almost didn't answer. Almost. But mothers never stop answering, no matter how worried they are. Hey, Mama. His voice immediately filled the room. Warm. Familiar. Safe. Sarah smiled despite herself. Hello, sweetheart. Marcus paused. There it was again. The strain. The exhaustion. The sadness she thought she was hiding. He glanced toward a stack of legal documents sitting on his own desk. The uneasy feeling from weeks earlier had never disappeared. In fact, it had grown stronger. How are you? Sarah hesitated. Just long enough. Marcus noticed. What happened? Nothing. The same answer. The same lie. But this time Marcus didn't let it go. Mama. His voice softened. Please. The word hung between them. Sarah closed her eyes. For 25 years, she had protected these boys. Even now. Even when they were grown men. Even when they no longer needed protecting. Finally she exhaled. And told him everything. The letters. The meetings. The threats. The confusion. The fear. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted several seconds. Then Marcus asked a question. One simple question. Why didn't you tell us? Sarah looked around the empty kitchen. The old refrigerator. The faded curtains. The photographs on the wall. Then she answered honestly. Because you've both worked so hard. Marcus lowered his head. Interesting. Very interesting. Because parents spend decades sacrificing for their children. Sometimes they forget those children would gladly sacrifice something in return. After hanging up, Marcus made another call. Then another. Then another. Across the country, a different phone began ringing. Michael answered on the second ring. Marcus, we have a problem. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Neither brother wasted time. Neither needed convincing. Because some debts aren't measured in money. And some obligations never expire. The next morning Sarah woke early. She couldn't explain why. Something felt different. The rain had returned. The sky looked darker, heavier, as though the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Around 9 o'clock, she noticed activity outside. Several unfamiliar vehicles. A property manager she recognized. Two men she didn't. People pointing, talking, watching. The knock returned. Stronger this time. Then came another knock. Louder than before. Much louder. Sarah opened the door. Two police officers stood on the porch, rain dripping from their uniforms. One of them held paperwork. The other rested a hand near his radio. Sarah's heart sank. Immediately. What is this? The older officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, we've received a complaint regarding unlawful occupancy of the property. The words didn't feel real. They felt borrowed, like something from somebody else's life. Sarah stared, unable to process them. This is my home. The officers exchanged a brief glance. The younger one looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. But procedure was procedure. At least that's what they'd been told. Outside, neighbors slowly emerged onto porches, watching, whispering, recording. Rainwater pooled along the curb. The property manager stood nearby under an umbrella, avoiding eye contact. Interesting. Very interesting. Because people often look away when they know something feels wrong. Sarah stepped onto the porch. The rain immediately soaked her coat. I've lived here 25 years. Nobody responded. Not because they didn't hear her. Because nobody present had the authority to fix what was happening. The older officer shifted uneasily. Ma'am, we're asking for your cooperation. Sarah looked at the house, then at the street, then at the officers, and suddenly something inside her broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, the way hearts usually break. Because after everything, after every sacrifice, after every year spent building a family, she was about to lose the last physical piece of it. The officer reached for his radio. The crowd grew larger. Phones continued recording. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching engines cut through the rain. At first nobody paid attention. Then a black SUV turned onto the street, followed by another, and another. The vehicles moved with purpose, directly towards Sarah's house. The crowd began turning. The officers noticed. The property manager noticed. Sarah noticed. What nobody knew yet was that the two little boys she once rescued from a shelter were finally coming home. And within the next few minutes, everything was about to change. The first SUV stopped directly in front of the house. Then the second, then the third. Rain continued falling, cold drops bouncing off black paint and wet pavement. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the officers, not the neighbors, not the property manager. Everyone simply watched. Interesting. Very interesting. Because sometimes an entire situation changes before a single word is spoken. The driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out. Dark overcoat. Confident posture. Purpose in every movement. A second man emerged from the vehicle behind him. Just as tall. Just as focused. And for one brief moment, Sarah didn't recognize either of them. 25 years had a way of doing that. The little boys from the shelter were gone. These were grown men now. Strong men. Accomplished men. Men who carried themselves differently than children ever could. Then the first man looked toward the porch, toward the woman standing in the rain. And everything changed. Mama. The word cut through the storm. Sarah froze. Completely froze. The world seemed to stop moving. The rain. The crowd. The officers. Everything. Because no matter how old a child becomes, a mother always recognizes that voice. Marcus. Her voice barely escaped her lips. Michael was already climbing the steps. Neither man cared about the rain. Neither man cared about the crowd. Neither man cared about the cameras recording. Only Sarah. Only her. Michael reached her first, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tightly, the way frightened little boys hold on to safety. Interesting. Very interesting. Because success changes many things, but it rarely changes who people run toward when they're hurting. Sarah's eyes filled immediately. Not from fear. Not anymore. Relief. Pure relief. Marcus stepped onto the porch beside them, looking at the officers, looking at the paperwork, looking at the property manager, then back at Sarah. What happened? The question sounded calm. But Sarah knew him, knew that calm. It was the same calm he had before difficult exams, before important arguments, before moments that mattered. The calm that came before action. The property manager stepped forward, trying to regain control. Sir, this is a legal property matter. Marcus looked at him, then slowly accepted the folder from one of the officers. He opened it, read for less than 30 seconds, then looked up. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the expression on his face wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The kind lawyers develop after years of spotting weak arguments. Very weak arguments. Michael noticed it too. What is it? Marcus closed the folder. A mess. The property manager shifted uncomfortably. The neighbors leaned closer. And for the first time all morning, the officers appeared relieved someone knowledgeable had arrived. The older officer cleared his throat. You know the situation? Marcus nodded. I know enough. A brief pause. Then he added, and I know this shouldn't have reached this point. The words landed heavily. Because they weren't emotional. They were factual. And facts are difficult to argue with. Interesting. Very interesting. Because truth often sounds quiet, yet carries enormous weight. The next hour unfolded quickly, faster than Sarah could follow. Phone calls, documents, property records, archived filings, ownership histories. Mistakes began appearing, then inconsistencies, then serious questions. The development company challenging the property had relied on incomplete records. Several filings had never been properly reviewed. Multiple assumptions had been treated as facts. And somewhere along the way, Sarah Johnson had become collateral damage. The older officer lowered his head. The property manager stopped talking. The crowd grew silent. Because suddenly everyone understood. The problem had never been Sarah. Not once. Around noon, another vehicle arrived. Then another. Attorneys. Representatives. People with authority. People who should have been involved weeks earlier. Maybe months earlier. Marcus spoke with them quietly. Professionally. Michael remained beside Sarah, holding an umbrella over her, just like she once held one over him walking to school. Interesting. Very interesting. Because life has a strange way of returning kindness. Years later, when least expected, by early afternoon, the situation was over. Officially over. The ownership challenge was suspended. The complaint withdrawn. The investigation reopened. Sarah wasn't going anywhere. The house wasn't going anywhere. The crowd slowly dispersed. The officers apologized. The property manager left without saying much. Perhaps because there wasn't much left to say. Then silence returned. Not the lonely silence Sarah had known recently. A peaceful one. The kind that arrives after a storm passes. Sarah stood on the porch, looking at her home. Really looking at it. The chipped paint. The old mailbox. The flower bed she planted years ago. Still there. Still hers. Still home. Tears slipped down her cheeks. This time nobody mistook them for rain. Marcus stepped beside her. You should have called. Sarah laughed softly. A tired laugh. I know. Michael smiled. You taught us something a long time ago. Sarah looked at him. What was that? Michael didn't hesitate. The world may forget you. Marcus immediately finished the sentence. But don't ever forget who helped you become who you are. The words settled into the afternoon air. The same words Sarah repeated hundreds of times when they were children. The same words she thought had disappeared into memory. Interesting. Very interesting. Because love often leaves fingerprints we don't notice until years later. Sarah wiped her eyes, then shook her head. You boys remembered. Marcus laughed. Remembered? Michael smiled. We built our lives on it. For several seconds nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Some truths don't require explanation. They only require presence. Later that evening the three of them sat together on the front porch. Just like they used to. The rain had stopped. The sky glowed orange and gold. Birds moved between telephone wires. The neighborhood felt quiet. Safe. Whole. Michael sat in the old rocking chair Sarah once used while reading bedtime stories. Marcus balanced a paper plate of barbecue on his knee. Sarah watched them both. Still amazed. Still grateful. Still seeing flashes of the little boys they used to be. Finally Marcus looked toward her. Mama. She smiled. Yes. His voice softened. You saved us first. Michael nodded. Both men looked emotional now. Not embarrassed. Not ashamed. Just honest. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Because after all these years, after all the sacrifices, after all the nights, she worried whether she had done enough. Here was her answer. Sitting beside her. Alive. Good. Kind. Strong. She reached for their hands. One on each side. And squeezed gently. Then she smiled. The same smile that welcomed two frightened boys into a tiny apartment 25 years earlier. The same smile that never disappeared. You saved me too. The sun slipped lower. Three silhouettes rocked gently on an old porch. No cameras. No headlines. No speeches. Just a family. The family they chose. The family they built. The family that survived. Because love invested in people never disappears. Sometimes, it simply takes years to come home. The end. CTA, if this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And remember, the greatest investment you'll ever make isn't money. It's the people you choose to love when they have nothing to offer in return.